Welcome back, Wonders. It's Naidra. First and foremost, happy Valentine's Day to everyone. Secondly, I wanted to bring to you guys today my very favorite build of Season 7, which is the Inferno Fireball Shatter build, which I'm going to be quite honest, I did not come up with this one. I got this one from Roxy. So Roxy, thank you and shout out to you. As shown in Roxy's video, this build is capable of handling pit tiers up to level 142, but I will say that is due to the build being fully optimized and it's got perfect gear. And so up until you get to that point, you're still going to be able to handle really high level content, including pit tiers level 100 and higher. However, if you want to take it all the way up to pit tiers 142, you will need to have the perfect gear in order to do so. So with that being said, for today, I'm going to show you guys how this build works. And then as usual, we'll come back to town. We'll take a look and see what the equipment looks like, and we'll go through the skill tree and everything else as well. Before we dive into it though, if you guys have not yet subscribed to the channel, please don't forget to do so below. Let's go ahead and dive right in. Alrighty, so the way that this build is going to work is first we're going to cast Firewall just to get some fire started, and then we'll teleport over to our enemies once we've got them grouped up, and we'll use Frost Nova to freeze them. Ice Armor will give us some additional damage as well, so we want to have that on as frequently as possible. Once we've got those things going, we're going to use Inferno to start dealing some damage, and then we'll take them out using Fireball, which isn't doing direct damage, but that really is just doing some shatter and area damage to get rid of everything else that's left at that point. So it does take a second to get this started, but once you do have it started, again, they'll explode. You should be able to do damage in the billions, and sometimes you'll also see trillions of damage, which is what makes this work. Now, the key to this is, especially if you're going to be using this in pit tiers level 140 or higher, you will have to have at least about 5,000 vulnerable damage, because that's where a majority of our damage is coming from with this. We're not relying on critical strike. We're not relying on damage over time. It's more specifically just going to be vulnerable damage itself. With that said, let's go ahead and see exactly how this is going to work. It does help if you group up your enemies more. If you're good at that, then this will be super easy and you'll be able to complete your pit tiers really quick. If not, you'll still be able to get them done. It just will take a little bit longer, because once again, the thing that happens with this build is we're dealing area damage and we're dealing shatter damage, and we are heavily relying on that to make this work. So let's see how this does. Boom. And again, the more enemies you have, the better it's going to be, but I think you're getting the idea of how this works here. Let's get one more group in before we go back to town. And once you really get going, you should be able to just teleport throughout the whole pit instead of having to stop and walk around. However, again, for the purpose of demonstration, this is what it's going to look like. So that said, let's go back to town and see what's making this work. All right, so first, let's go ahead and take a look at the equipment. Starting off with our primary weapon, we are going to be using a wand. Your wand is going to give you additional vulnerable damage, so it is important that we're using this. And then as far as the stats, we're going to be taking intelligence, maximum life, and vulnerable damage. And then we're going to temper on vulnerable damage once again, with a chance for Inferno to deal double damage. Now, we are dealing quite a bit of damage with our Inferno, which is great, but again, a majority is coming from Shatter, so having more vulnerable damage is going to be more important. Therefore, once you go to masterwork your stuff, I would recommend for your weapon that we're masterworking all 3 points if possible into your vulnerable damage that you tempered on. Now, for the actual aspect itself, we are using the vehement aspect. This is what allows us to get an additional up to 30% times damage, plus it's giving us 2 additional ultimate ranks. And once again, this is an Inferno build, so that is really helpful to have. Next up, we've got our boots. We are going to be using Flicker Step with this build specifically. Again, we are heavily relying on our ultimate to be able to deal damage, at least that initial part of the damage. So we are going to take Flicker Step, and this is what allows us to be able to use more than one Inferno at a time. Sometimes you'll see 3 or 4 up at the same time, depending on how many enemies you're going up against. But we are going to take Flicker Step. And if you get one with the GA, I'd recommend having that GA on ultimate damage or your damage reduction from close enemies. We're not going to have any survivability issues with this build. I haven't died a single time since I've been using this, so I don't think that you should be concerned with it. However, just to be safe, if you can, I would grab that as well. Now, when we look at masterworking this, we're going to put all 3 points into ultimate damage. Next up, we've got our pants. For our pants, we are using the concussive strikes aspect. This allows us to deal an additional 25% damage to our enemies that are dazed, which is going to be happening quite frequently because we're hitting so often. As far as the stats, we're going to be taking intelligence, maximum life, and armor. And then for our tempers, we want our enemies to be frozen as frequently as possible. Therefore, we're going to take the lucky hit chance to freeze our enemies. And then also, we want to use Frost Nova as frequently as possible as well. So we're going to take Frost Nova cooldown reduction for this part. If you're struggling with your armor, you can take total armor instead of the Frost Nova cooldown reduction. However, you should be at the armor cap if you're using similar items as I am, so you shouldn't need to do that. Now, when masterworking this one, we want to try to get all 3 points of your masterwork into our intelligence. And then moving on up to our gloves, we are going to be using the Storm Swell aspect with this. Now for our gloves, we want to make sure we're taking intelligence. If possible, we actually want to have attack speed instead of the critical strike chance. So this is just another part where I have a little bit of opportunity with this build. And then of course, we're going to take vulnerable damage as well. We're also going to temper on a chance to freeze with this. Again, we want our enemies to be frozen all the time. And then we're going to also temper on pyromancy attack speed. Now, if for some reason you can't get the pyromancy attack speed on here, but end up with pyromancy critical strike damage, that's okay too. But the attack speed is going to allow us to use more fireballs, and your fireballs are going to deal 10% damage to your enemies as well. So that's going to give us the most damage output possible. So definitely recommend getting that on here. And then when we look at masterworking, we want to try to put all 3 points of masterwork into your vulnerable damage here as well. Now, moving on to our chest armor, we are going to be taking the Shroud of False Death. The +1 to all passives is just too good not to take. And then when we're looking at masterworking, you can either masterwork all stats or you can masterwork your maximum life, depending on what your life looks like. And if you're having survivability issues, I'm not, so I chose to put all of them into all stats. That's going to give us some additional damage output as well, which it makes it worth having. And then we've got our Shaco for our helmet. This really does help because of that additional cooldown reduction we're getting. This allows us to cast our skills that much more frequently. We're getting some damage reduction, but the most important one is we're getting +4 to all skills as well. So really important to have this. Without this, you can make the build work, but you're certainly not going to be able to take this as far. You're going to be losing a lot of damage output from not having the +4 to all ranks. Moving on to our amulet, we are going to be using the Shredding Blades aspect with this. And then when we look at our stats, we want to take intelligence. If possible, we want to have ranks of inner flames, and actually that's the one we would want to masterwork as well. And then we're also going to want to take permafrost. Now it's really difficult to find an amulet that's got both of those on there. So if you end up with something like mine, that's great. We really don't need the critical strike chance with this, so we could do without that. But nonetheless, this still seems to be working just fine. And then we're going to be tempering on evade cooldown reduction. We want to be able to teleport as frequently as we can. And then we're also going to temper on vulnerable damage, where once again, if you got one that's got ranks to inner flames, put all 3 masterworking points into that. If not, then you can put all 3 of your masterworking points into vulnerable damage. As like I mentioned earlier, we want to have around 5,000 or more vulnerable damage to really be able to do the maximum amount of damage we can. Next up, for our first ring, we're going to be using the Conceited aspect, and this one we're taking intelligence, attack speed, and vulnerable damage. So this one is perfect. That's exactly what we want to see on here. And then we're going to temper on pyromancy attack speed, and we're going to temper on inferno cooldown reduction with this as well. Like I mentioned, we don't have very much struggles with our ultimate skill cooling down pretty quickly thanks to our Shaco, and we've got a couple of places where we're reducing its cooldown here as well, so it's really good, but we want to be able to use that as frequently as possible. Besides just the damage that it deals, Inferno also does pull enemies in a little bit as well, so that is super helpful for us to have. Now, when you go to masterwork this, we want to put all 3 points of your masterworking into vulnerable damage once again. But unfortunately, we're not quite there yet. And once again, we are able to handle quite a bit with this build, even with it not being fully optimized at this point. For our second ring, we're going to be taking Tal Rasha's. I think this one is a standard item for basically every sorcerer build that there is out there. Really, really helpful to have. If you can, grab one that's got a GA on cooldown reduction. And then when you go to masterwork this, we're going to want to put all 3 points of your masterwork into cooldown reduction. And then lastly, for our focus, we're going to be using the intercom aspect with this one. We are moving around quite a bit, but this one is especially helpful when we're going up against bosses. That's a time where we are going to be sitting still for a couple of seconds. And the intercom aspect has been updated to now be able to deal up to triple of that 13% damage bonus. So it really does give us quite a bit additional damage output with this. And as for stats, we're going to be taking intelligence, maximum life, and we're going to take cooldown reduction with this. And then we're going to temper on vulnerable damage and chance for Inferno to deal double damage. Now for this one, unlike our primary weapon that we use, we want to hit all 3 points of our masterworking into Chance for Inferno to deal double damage. We want to make sure that we're doing as much as we possibly can with our ultimate skill, and between having Chance for Inferno to deal double damage on our weapon and also on our offhand, it'll make it so we're almost always going to be dealing double damage when we're casting our ultimate. Now taking a look at our gems, for our weapon and offhand we're going to be using Sapphire. For our pants, we're going to throw on Topaz. And then for our runes on our chest armor, we're going to be taking Zan and Ohm. This is going to allow us to cast Warcry, which gives us an additional 15% damage. And then for our helmet, we're going to be using Yule and Vex. We're constantly casting skills that have cooldown, and also it gives us +1 to all skills for 10 seconds. So basically, we're going to have an additional +1 and the +4 from the Shaco. So we're getting +5 to our skills just from the single one item we're using here. Looking at our Okul gems, we're going to be using Friend of the Bog. We also will be using Voice of the Stars. And then lastly, we've got Hungering Void, which is what allows us to pull our enemies in very frequently and allows us to be able to deal that area shatter damage that we deal with this build. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at our witch powers. For our witch powers, for our unique witch power, we are going to be using Vengeful Spirit. Then we will take Hex of Whispers. We'll also be taking Purging Touch. Next, we've got Aura of Siphoning. We're going to be using Breath of the Coven. And lastly, we've got Soul Harvest. Now, ideally, we want to have these at level 20, but as long as you've got them at level 10 or higher, should be good to go. Next up, for our skill tree, we're going to be taking Firebolt. We'll then take it on up to Enhanced Firebolt and finish it up with Glinting Firebolt. This will be our enchantment that we use, and we will be benefiting from the additional 25% times damage that we get from Glinting Firebolt, so it is important that we take that. We'll then move our way on down to our core skills, where we're going to take just 1 point into Fireball. We'll take it on up to Enhanced Fireball and finish it up with Greater Fireball. We also will be taking 3 points into Elemental Dominance. Moving on down to our defensive skills, we're going to take just 1 point into Flameshield. We'll then take 1 point into Teleport, take it on up to Enhanced Teleport, and then we'll finish it up with Mystical Teleport. We also will be taking 3 points into Glass Cannon, 1 point into Ice Armor, and taking that down to Enhanced Ice Armor, and then finishing it up with Mystical Ice Armor. And then lastly, for our defensive skills, and basically all of the defensive skills, we're going to be taking Frost Nova down to Enhanced Frost Nova, and finishing it up with Mystical Frost Nova. It is really important that we are taking Mystical Frost Nova because the majority of the damage, like I mentioned, we're dealing is vulnerable damage. And so we want to make sure our enemies are always vulnerable. And we're also getting some additional damage that is going out from this as well. So really important to take this. We'll then move our way on down to our conjuration skills. We will not be using any conjurations with this build, but we will be taking 1 point into Align the Elements. And then we will be taking 3 points into Protection. And then we also will be taking 3 points into Mana Shield. And then moving on down to our mastery skills, we will be taking 2 points into Icy Veil. We will be taking 3 points into Inner Flames. And like I mentioned, if you get an amulet that has Inner Flames on it too, it would be really helpful to have, as it's going to increase the overall damage to our healthy enemies. And that's really the only time we have any issues with dealing damage, is at the very beginning part of it. So if you can masterwork it, get as many ranks of Inner Flames as you can. And then we are going to be taking 5 points into Firewall, taking it down to Enhanced Firewall, and finishing it up with Mage's Firewall. And then moving on down to our ultimate skills, we will be taking 3 points into Permafrost. We also will be taking 3 points into Icy Touch and 3 points into Hoarfrost. And then for our actual ultimate, because this is an Inferno build, naturally we'll be taking 5 points into Inferno. We'll then take it on up to Prime Inferno and finish it up with Supreme Inferno. And then we also will be taking 3 points into Endless Pyre, 1 point into Warmth, and 3 points into Soulfire. And then on the right hand side, we also will be taking 3 points into Elemental Synergies and 3 points into Evocation. And then finally, we are using Shatter with this build, so we will be taking the Shatter key passive. Next up, we've got our Paragon board. For our first board, we will be taking the Elementalist glyph. And then we'll make our way over to the second board, which is going to be Frigid Fate. And this one, we're going to be pairing up with the Tactician Glyph. And then we'll make our way over to the left for our third board, which is going to be the Fundamental Release board. And this one, we're going to be pairing up with the Torch Glyph. Now, as you can see, I have 79 willpower right now surrounding this specific node here. You don't need to have all of that right off the bat until you get to the level that I'm currently at. If you're already where I'm at, then yes, you want to take as much willpower around it as you can to increase the burning damage. However, we do want to grab all 5 boards before we start to max out on each individual glyph. We just need to have enough points to activate the additional bonus at the bottom before we move on to the next board. And speaking of the next board, going on to our fourth board on the top right hand side, we're going to be taking the Burning Instinct board. And this one, we're going to be pairing up with the Flame Feeder glyph. Now, same idea here, we just need to have enough so that we can move on to the next board, but eventually we want to circle back and grab all the dexterity we possibly can. And then lastly, for our fifth and our final board, we're going to be taking the Ceaseless Conduit board. We are going to be taking advantage of this at all times, and that 60% times additional damage is extremely helpful to have, especially against bosses. And this board, we're going to be pairing up with the Exploit Glyph, which really helps us with quite a bit of vulnerable damage as well, and it's super useful overall. Now, that said, let's jump on over to our Mercenary. For our Mercenary, we are going to be taking Rahir, and with this, we're going to take Ground Slam, take it down to Rahir's Aegis, Bastion, and we'll finish this one up with Inspiration. And then for our reinforcement, we will be taking Aldkin for the first time. And Aldkin is going to be using Storm of Fire, which will trigger whenever the player casts any skill in combat. With that said, that's all I have for you guys for today. If you guys liked this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, Wanderers.